So classroom management is another area in which you can use behaviorism apart from instruction and assessment. Two important ideas you want to remember with classroom management are rules and procedures. Rules are the do's and do nots of a classroom, and they should be kept pretty simple in 3 to 5 rules. However, procedures are all those how-tos that you would do in the classroom, and there are a ton of procedures. How do you enter the classroom? How do you leave? How do you ask to go to the bathroom? How do you ask to get a drink of water? How do you sharpen your pencil? What do you do when you're done with your homework? Where do you turn things in? So all of those things are procedures. And this is where behaviorism shines in working with students on these procedures. First, procedures need to be taught just like you were teaching any academic content, particularly using that direct instruction model. So you're going to tell students what the procedure is for, you're going to orient them, you're going to teach the procedure, and then you're going to have students practice, practice, practice. That I do, we do, you do model works very well for these procedures. Another area of behaviorism in the classroom is this idea of principle of least intervention, which basically means you're going to do the least amount of punishment or reinforcement necessary to elicit the response or the behavior that you want. No more, no less, but the least amount that you need to. So part of the principle of least intervention is going through this list. So starting with differential reinforcement, that's the least invasive strategy, going all the way down to negative consequences at the bottom of the list. So differential reinforcement is the idea that you're going to reinforce a behavior that is incompatible with the misbehavior or the behavior you want to stop. So if the student is constantly getting up out of his or her seat, you're going to reinforce staying in his or her seat, because you can't stay in your seat and also get up out of your seat. So you're going to reinforce something to increase that behavior, which means you're also going to be decreasing the other behavior. You can also ignore students, and notice it says planned ignoring. This is because you're intentionally ignoring. It's not that you don't see the misbehavior, but you're intentionally ignoring it. So if students are whispering and one student says, "Hey, did you hear what she just said?" and the other student says, "Yeah, she said get out your textbook," then you don't need to stop class and say, "Why are you two students talking?" You would just ignore that and keep going. You can also use cues and signals and proximity and touch control. This is giving some kind of signal, a thumbs up when a student's doing great, or a look when they're not doing something, or walking by their desk, which is proximity, or touching their desk, which is touch control, to give them a little cue or a little signal that, hey, you're doing something you don't need to be doing, or good job, you're doing something that I would like you to. Another idea is helping over hurdles or program restructuring, interest boosting. Those all three kind of go together. Sometimes students misbehave because they don't understand, or they're bored, or they're not interested in the content. So you can make it more interesting, more engaging, or you can help those students get started, which is helping over hurdles. Token economy is where students get tickets or get some kind of little token to trade in or buy something that they want. You'll see that at South Wing. And then negative consequences are those punishments, which we will talk about a little bit later. For these kinds of things, you want to make sure two things to keep in mind with these behavior strategies. One, avoid nagging. Just like continuous reinforcement eventually loses its effectiveness, nagging is really thought of as continuous punishment, which becomes ineffective as well. And the second is forced apologies. You want to make sure that the stimulus and response that you're getting are what you want. So a lot of times with forced apologies, the stimulus is a punishment. You're forcing the student to apologize. But the response is not necessarily that they learn to feel sorry, but they learn to apologize, which are not necessarily the same thing, even though we would like them to be. So forcing that apology makes a student learn that those are different rather than you apologize when you actually feel sorry. And another important idea to remember with behaviorism and behaviorist strategies is they are all short term. Students are learning a response to a stimulus, not actually learning the behaviors or the characteristics that would elicit those behaviors on their own. So they're very short term. Another idea we can take from behaviorism is the pre-MAC principle, which is also called Grandma's rule. And this is the idea that students can quote unquote earn something they like if they do something they don't want first. So the reason it's called Grandma's rule is grandmas always say you can have your dessert after you eat your vegetables. So the idea is to get through something you don't like, the vegetables, to get to something you do like, dessert. So you could use this in the classroom if a student doesn't really like math, but they love playing on the computer. Well, you can play on the computer after you finish your math assignment. So that's Grandma's rule, or the pre-MAC principle. Shaping and fading are yet another idea we can take from behaviorism. Shaping is reinforcing successive approximations of behavior. So you're reinforcing gradual steps to the behavior that you want, to a more complex behavior. So if I want a student to learn how to walk to line up, he might walk the first few steps and then run. I'll reinforce him for walking those first few steps, but the next time he has to walk more steps before he starts running. Fading is slowly removing reinforcement to a level that will maintain that behavior. So you want to fade out your reinforcement. So eventually students will do it on their own without constantly being reinforced, or reinforced intermittently. You want them to be able to do the behavior on their own without any external. So that's where fading comes in. So shaping is helping the student get to a point, and fading is after they've reached the behavior or the response you slowly remove reinforcement to the point where they can do it on their own. Applied behavior analysis comes out of behaviorism, and to remember applied behavior analysis, remember A, B, C. So to figure out when working with a student, you want to look at not just their misbehavior, but the antecedent, what happens before that behavior. Then you decide what the misbehavior is, or the behavior, and then the consequence that comes out of that, so that you can figure out why the behavior occurred in the first place and how best to have a consequence to reinforce that behavior or punish that behavior. And you want to make sure that the consequence, as with all behavior strategies, is contiguous, or that it occurs close together with the actual behavior, so that those become stimulus and response, that students either knowingly or unknowingly respond to the stimulus you want. So they need to be contiguous and close together. So we've talked about punishment and how that can decrease undesired behaviors. But some types of punishment are ineffective or are not good for what we want to use them for. Here's a list of some that are ineffective: physical or psychological punishment, extra classwork, removing recess, and out-of-school suspension. Physical and psychological punishment, such as berating a student, or physical punishment, paddling a student, corporal punishment, those are obviously not good to use, but they're also ineffective. They in turn make students want to rebel or have very negative consequences rather than just decreasing the undesired behavior. Extra classwork is ineffective because that becomes a stimulus. So if you were giving extra math homework or extra reading as a form of punishment, students will begin to associate that classwork or that subject with punishment and won't like that subject area anymore, or won't like school anymore, which is not a desired behavior. So extra classwork is not a good form of punishment. Removing recess is also ineffective. If you're trying to punish a student and you take away their one outlet for getting out energy, you're just creating more problems for yourself. Students that are 7 and 8 years old, those are the most active years on average for a student. And so if you take away their one time to get that energy out, you're just creating more problems for yourself and for that student. And then out of school suspension is ineffective because most students just go home, watch TV, play video games, are unsupervised. So it's not really a good form of punishment because it just lets some students learn they can get off the hook rather than having an actual punishment. So it might actually increase behaviors rather than decrease the undesired behavior. Now that we've talked about how you can use behaviorism, let's talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of it before we move on to cognitive theories. So some strengths of behaviorism is that it focuses on observable behavior. If it's observable, it's easy to measure. So that's actually a strength of behaviorism. Another strength is the learner is active. It's not just someone poking and prodding at people. The learner can react. And the third way is it can be effective. Some of those strategies are very effective that we've discussed. So some weaknesses. First, there's a focus on the observable, which I know I just said was a strength. But if you only focus on observable behaviors, you miss a lot of learning because not everything can be observed and not everything can be checked off on a checklist. Another weakness is the intrinsic motivation, the motivation that people have to do things on their own. Behaviorism does not take into account that people might be motivated on their own, and it can actually hurt someone's motivation because they are simply reacting to a stimulus. They're not thinking about it. They're not wondering about something. They're just reacting.